Episode 29, The Triumphs of Nationalism, The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back, everyone! Today we're diving into one of the most dramatic chapters of 19th century Europe, the reshaping of states and the rise of nationalism. We'll cover Napoleon III's France, the unification of Italy, the Austro-Prussian War, Bismarck and the Franco-Prussian War, the creation of a German empire, Russia's reforms and unrest, the declining Ottoman Empire, and the decline of the Ottoman Empire. We'll save the discussion of what historians call the responsive nation-state for our next episode. With me, as always, is Dr. Morgan.
Thanks, Casey. This is a turning point chapter. It shows how nationalism shifted from being a revolutionary idea to a tool for conservative leaders. It also shows how governments learned to respond to mass politics, making states more flexible and modern.
And of course, we're also joined by Professor Theo.
Hello, Casey. Hello, everyone. I'll be especially looking at how these political changes shaped societies, how ordinary people experienced nationalism, and how culture and identity adapted to new state structures.
Let's start with France. Napoleon III seems like such a complicated figure.
He was. To really understand him, we need to go back to the Revolution of 1848. After the fall of King Louis Philippe, France declared the Second Republic. In the presidential election that year, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the famous Napoleon I, ran as a candidate. He had little political experience, but his name carried immense weight, especially among peasants who remembered the Napoleonic era as one of glory and stability.
His campaign was brilliant. He promised order to conservatives, prosperity to businessmen, and attention to the needs of workers and peasants. He traveled the countryside, presenting himself as a man of the people. The result was a landslide victory. He won more than 5 million votes, compared to fewer than 2 million for all other candidates combined.
Wow, so people voted more for the name than his policies?
Exactly, Casey. His name symbolized strength and stability. But when his 4-year presidential term was about to expire, the Constitution barred re-election. So in December 1851, Louis Napoleon staged a coup d'etat. He dissolved the National Assembly, arrested opponents, and appealed directly to the people through a plebiscite. Over 7 million Frenchmen voted to approve his seizure of power.
That's right. And 1 year later, another plebiscite proclaimed him Emperor Napoleon III. So, his empire was born not only from force, but also from mass approval at the ballot box.
At first, his rule was authoritarian. He censored the press, restricted assemblies, and used police surveillance. But he also worked to modernize the economy.
And he appealed directly to the people through plebiscites, those public votes that gave him legitimacy. Many supported him because he delivered prosperity and seemed to embody national greatness.
What kind of prosperity?
France saw rapid industrial growth, new banking systems, and infrastructure projects. Napoleon III encouraged the building of railroads, which tied the nation together economically and politically. He promoted the creation of modern investment banks like Crédit Mobilier, which helped finance factories and new industries. Agriculture also benefited. New drainage projects and scientific methods boosted yields, making rural populations more supportive of the regime. Most famously, he hired Baron Haussmann to remake Paris. Wide boulevards, green parks, new sanitation and water systems. It was a massive Haussmannization of the capital.
That project wasn't just about beauty or hygiene. It also made Paris easier for troops to control. Broad boulevards meant fewer barricades in case of revolt. So, modernization was tied to political control.
Did his rule stay authoritarian?
Not entirely. By the 1860s, his regime liberalized. He allowed more parliamentary power, loosened censorship, and won support from workers by legalizing trade unions. He permitted freer debate in the legislature, relaxed restrictions on the press, and even granted workers the right to strike. These changes created an atmosphere where public opinion mattered more, and many French citizens began to see his regime as not only stable, but also somewhat responsive to their needs. Historians call this the liberal empire.
But his foreign policy was reckless and ultimately disastrous. He sought to restore French prestige abroad by intervening in Italy, supporting nationalist movements against Austria in 1859, and by attempting to build a French-controlled empire in Mexico during the 1860s. That Mexican adventure ended in humiliation when the puppet emperor Maximilian was overthrown and executed. Napoleon III also engaged in risky diplomacy in the Crimean War and tried to play the role of great power mediator in Europe. Each of these efforts strained resources and credibility. Finally, his reckless provocations toward Prussia backfired. His defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 brought down his empire and gave birth to the French Third Republic.
Okay, moving to Italy, how did unification happen there?
Italy was divided into many states. The movement for unity was known as the Risorgimento, meaning resurgence or revival. It was both a cultural and political campaign to bring the Italian people together under a single nation. In the earlier decades, the revolutionary thinker Giuseppe Mazzini founded the group Young Italy and inspired many with his vision of a united, republican Italy. His efforts in the 1830s and 1840s stirred nationalist feeling, though most of his uprisings were suppressed.
Mazzini's dream of a democratic republic deeply influenced later leaders, but after 1848, it became clear that unification would not succeed through popular revolution alone. That's where Count Camillo di Cavour, Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, took charge. He practiced realpolitik, forging alliances and pursuing limited goals. Cavour was a skilled diplomat. He carefully balanced liberal reforms at home, like improving agriculture and fostering industry, with the need to reassure conservatives and the monarchy. He secured support from Britain and especially Napoleon III of France. In 1859, with French military help, he defeated Austria at battles like Magenta and Solferino, gaining Lombardy. Sardinia-Piedmont also annexed several smaller northern duchies, Modena, Parma, and Tuscany, when nationalist uprisings there voted to join the new kingdom. These gains gave Piedmont-Sardinia control over most of northern Italy, laying the groundwork for a larger unification effort.
And what about Garibaldi?
Giuseppe Garibaldi represented the popular, romantic side of the Risorgimento. A legendary soldier, he gathered 1,000 volunteers, the Red Shirts, and launched a daring campaign in 1860. Landing in Sicily, his forces overthrew the Bourbon rulers there and marched triumphantly north into Naples. Garibaldi's charisma and his reputation as a champion of the people made his campaign wildly popular. But instead of pressing on to Rome and risking conflict with Cavour and the king, Garibaldi was subtly redirected by Cavour. The Prime Minister feared that Garibaldi might attack the Papal States, which would provoke Catholic outrage and possibly French intervention. So Cavour moved quickly to arrange a meeting between Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel II. At that meeting, Garibaldi handed over his conquests, choosing unity over personal ambition. It was a dramatic act of sacrifice for unity, showing how revolutionary enthusiasm could merge with monarchic pragmatism.
The Catholic Church, however, opposed the Risorgimento in its early years, since unification threatened papal control over the Papal States. For decades, popes resisted the movement, urging Catholics not to cooperate with the new Italian state. This tension between the Church and the state would remain a major political issue in Italy for decades.
So, by 1861, Italy was unified?
Not fully. Venetia was added after the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. Rome only became part of Italy in 1870 when French troops withdrew. So unification was gradual and heavily shaped by international wars.
And note, this was unification from above. Peasants and workers were rarely included. In fact, at the start, only about 500,000 men out of a population of 22 million had the right to vote in the new kingdom, showing how limited political participation really was. There were also stark economic divisions. The industrializing, wealthier north contrasted with the more agricultural, impoverished south. These inequalities would trouble Italy for decades, even as the language of the Risorgimento inspired a generation of Italians with visions of a common identity.
Before we get into Bismarck's wars, can we back up a little? What was the situation in the German Confederation between 1848 and 1862?
Good point. After the failed revolutions of 1848, the German Confederation remained a loose association of 39 states dominated by Austria. Liberals had tried to create a united Germany at the Frankfurt Assembly, but their efforts collapsed when the Prussian king refused the crown from the gutter. That failure left a sense of disappointment, but nationalist feeling did not disappear. Instead, Prussia slowly increased its influence, especially through the Zollverein, a customs union that eliminated internal tariffs between most German states. It created a common economic market that boosted trade and industry, and importantly, it excluded Austria. This gave Prussia a leading economic role and allowed it to demonstrate that unification could be practical and beneficial. The Zollverein wasn't just about economics. It was a political tool that laid the foundation for Prussia to claim leadership in German affairs.
By the 1850s, the Confederation was politically stagnant. Austria still claimed leadership, but Prussia's economic clout and modernizing army made it a rival. Many German liberals debated whether a Kleindeutsch solution, unification without Austria, was more realistic than a Grossdeutsch one that included Austria. These unresolved questions formed the backdrop for Bismarck's rise in 1862.
Let's turn to Germany. How did Bismarck set the stage for unification?
Otto von Bismarck became Prussian prime minister in 1862 and made it clear that unification would come through, as he famously said, blood and iron. He refused to be bound by liberal parliaments, instead raising taxes and reorganizing the army without their approval. Bismarck was a master of realpolitik, a term meaning politics based on practical considerations and power rather than ideals or moral visions. He focused on what would work in reality, not what was theoretically just. To consolidate control, he openly defied the Prussian parliament. When legislators refused to approve higher taxes to fund army reforms, Bismarck simply collected the taxes anyway and used the money to strengthen the military. He argued that the Constitution was unclear and that in cases of conflict between the king and parliament, the government could act on its own. This bold move alienated liberals, but demonstrated his willingness to bend rules in order to achieve national goals.
His first big test came with Denmark in 1864. Together with Austria, Prussia fought Denmark to take control of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Prussia administered Schleswig, Austria took Holstein. But Bismarck was already scheming to provoke conflict with Austria itself.
So that led to the Austro-Prussian War?
Exactly. In 1866, Bismarck skillfully isolated Austria diplomatically. He secured Italian support by promising Venetia, and he ensured neutrality from France and Russia. When fighting broke out, the war lasted just 7 weeks. The decisive battle at Königgrätz proved Prussia's military superiority, thanks to modern railroads, breech-loading rifles, and superior organization.
The consequences were enormous. Austria was excluded from German affairs entirely. The old German Confederation was dissolved and replaced with the North German Confederation, dominated by Prussia. Bismarck cleverly offered concessions to liberals by granting the new parliament, the Reichstag, a role, though real power remained with Prussia's king and chancellor.
Did ordinary people support this?
Many did, especially as victories seemed to prove that strong leadership worked. Middle-class liberals who had once demanded parliaments and constitutions found themselves cheering for Bismarck's monarchy-led nationalism.
And that shows the turning point. Nationalism, once the cry of revolutionaries, was now being harnessed by conservative leaders to strengthen monarchies rather than overthrow them. Franco-Prussian War and the unification of Germany.
So, what finally brought the German states together under one empire?
The spark was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. The immediate cause was a dispute over a distant relative of the Prussian king being offered the Spanish throne. France, under Napoleon III, feared being encircled by Hohenzollern monarchs in both Prussia and Spain. Bismarck cleverly manipulated the situation. He edited and published the so-called Ems Dispatch, making it appear that the Prussian king had insulted the French ambassador. Outraged, the French government declared war on Prussia.
That was exactly what Bismarck wanted. He knew a French declaration of war would rally the southern German states to Prussia's side. And it worked. Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden joined in the fight. German nationalism surged as armies united against the common enemy.
How did the war go?
Very badly for France. Within weeks, Prussia and its allies surrounded Napoleon III's army at Sedan. The emperor himself was captured, and his regime collapsed. Paris held out under siege for months, but by early 1871 France had to surrender. The resulting Treaty of Frankfurt forced France to pay a huge indemnity and give up the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which became a lasting source of bitterness.
And on January 18th, and in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German princes proclaimed King William I of Prussia as German Emperor, Kaiser. This was a hugely symbolic moment. The unification of Germany under Prussian dominance, achieved not by liberal revolutions, but by conservative statecraft and military power.
So Germany was born in a palace of its old enemy?
Exactly. The symbolism was meant to humiliate France and demonstrate German strength. The new empire was a federal state with the King of Prussia as emperor and Bismarck as chancellor. It included universal male suffrage for the Reichstag, though real power still lay with the emperor, the army, and the bureaucracy. The unification of Germany dramatically shifted the balance of power in Europe, setting the stage for future conflicts.
And culturally, nationalism took on an even sharper edge. Germans celebrated their unity, but France nursed a deep resentment over Alsace-Lorraine. That rivalry would cast a long shadow into the 20th century. Russia, reform and reaction.
Let's shift east to Russia. What was happening there during this era?
Russia faced enormous pressure after its defeat in the Crimean War of the 1850s. That conflict pitted Russia against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, later joined by Sardinia-Piedmont. Fighting centered on the Crimean Peninsula and especially the long siege of Sevastopol. The war revealed the weakness of Russia's serf-based economy and its lack of modern railroads, industry, and military medicine. It was also one of the first wars covered extensively by journalists and photographed, shocking the European public with vivid accounts of suffering. That loss exposed how far behind Russia was in technology, transportation, and modern organization compared to Western Europe. When Alexander II came to power in 1855, he recognized the need for reform.
His most famous reform was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. More than 20 million peasants were technically freed from their landlords. On paper, this was a massive social transformation, but in practice it was limited. Serfs had to make long-term redemption payments for small plots of often poor-quality land, and village communes, the mirs, kept tight control over peasant life.
So they were free, but not really?
Exactly. The peasants were legally free but economically burdened. Meanwhile, Alexander II also introduced reforms in the legal system, creating independent courts with equality before the law and trial by jury. He reorganized the military, reducing the length of service and modernizing training. He even created local elected councils, the Zemstvos, which gave nobles and some peasants limited experience with self-government. But these reforms were halfway measures. The Zemstvos had only limited taxation powers, and most authority remained in the hands of nobles and the central government. Even Alexander's legal and military reforms offered improvements without fundamentally altering the autocracy. They raised expectations but left many groups, especially peasants and intellectuals, deeply dissatisfied. Alexander's economic reforms, however, were more successful. The government expanded the railway network, most famously beginning the long Trans-Siberian line, encouraged investment in industry, and promoted the growth of banking and finance. These measures helped Russia start to industrialize, particularly in textiles and metallurgy, even if the pace lagged behind Western Europe. At the same time, Russia expanded its territory to the east and south. Under Alexander II, Russian armies pushed into Central Asia, taking lands in Turkestan, and advanced in the Caucasus region. The empire also extended further into Siberia as the railway expanded. These territorial moves were meant to project power, secure borders, and open new resources, showing that Russia sought to modernize not only internally but also through imperial expansion.
Those reforms sparked hope, but also frustration. Educated Russians, the intelligentsia, wanted deeper change. Some turned to radical movements like the populist group People's Will, which believed in mobilizing peasants to overthrow the autocracy. Others leaned towards socialism or anarchism. When Alexander II hesitated and repressed dissent, radicals grew more violent. In 1881, members of the People's Will assassinated him with bombs in St. Petersburg.
Did that lead to more reform?
Sadly, no. His successor, Alexander III, responded with reaction, censorship, police repression, and efforts to strengthen the autocracy. Instead of liberalization, Russia entered a period of conservatism and repression. The pattern of reform followed by crackdown would repeat in Russian history, showing the limits of modernization without political freedom.
And socially, peasants continued to live in poverty, while industrialization was only beginning in the late 19th century. That mix of limited reform, harsh repression, and growing unrest planted seeds for the revolutions that would come in the 20th century.
But didn't Russia also face a major defeat in the early 1900s?
Yes, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Russia had expanded aggressively into East Asia, clashing with Japan over control of Manchuria and Korea. To the shock of the world, modernized Japan decisively defeated Russia on both land and sea. The loss of the fleet at Tsushima was especially humiliating. This was the first time an Asian power defeated a major European empire in modern times, and it exposed the deep weaknesses of the Russian state.
The defeat triggered unrest at home. In 1905, strikes and protests broke out across the empire. On what became known as Bloody Sunday, peaceful protesters marching to petition the Tsar in St. Petersburg were fired upon by troops, killing hundreds. That event shattered the image of the Tsar as the little father of the people.
The upheaval forced Tsar Nicholas II to make concessions. He issued the October Manifesto, granting basic civil rights and creating an elected parliament called the Duma. For the first time, Russia had a form of representative government, but the Tsar quickly limited its power. Elections were manipulated, and he retained control over the military, foreign policy, and bureaucracy. In 1906, Nicholas issued the Fundamental Laws, which further restricted the Duma's power by declaring that the Tsar alone had supreme authority over the state. These laws made clear that any concessions were tightly limited and reversible, leaving many Russians disillusioned with constitutional reform.
So again, reform was partial and disappointing. The revolution of 1905 showed the volatility of Russian society. The combination of industrial strikes, peasant uprisings, and nationalist movements among minority groups. It was a warning sign of the much larger upheavals to come in 1917. The declining Ottoman Empire.
We've talked about France, Italy, Germany, and Russia. What about the Ottoman Empire? It's often called the sick man of Europe during this period.
Exactly. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was losing territory and struggling to keep up with Europe's military and economic power. Nationalist movements among Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and other groups challenged Ottoman rule, while Russia and Austria eyed expansion into Ottoman lands. The Crimean War had already revealed how vulnerable the empire was.
The Ottomans did try to reform. During the Tanzimat reforms of the 1830s to 1870s, the government attempted to modernize the military, centralize administration, and grant new rights to subjects regardless of religion. New legal codes, schools, and railways were introduced, but the reforms often remained on paper more than in practice, and conservative religious leaders resisted them.
Did the reforms succeed in uniting the empire?
Not really. The Ottomans faced constant nationalist revolts in the Balkans, and great powers like Russia and Austria often intervened, supposedly to protect Christian minorities, but really to expand their own influence. The empire lost major wars against Russia in the 1870s, leading to independence for Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, and autonomy for Bulgaria. Each defeat chipped away at Ottoman authority.
And inside the empire, intellectuals and reformers debated how to save it. Some embraced Ottomanism, the idea of loyalty to the empire regardless of ethnicity or religion. Others pushed for Islamic reform, emphasizing the Sultan's role as caliph. Still others joined the Young Turk movement, which demanded a constitutional government. These divisions made it hard to create unity.
So, by the end of the century, the empire was still declining?
Yes, despite efforts, the Ottoman state could not fully modernize its economy or military. The empire remained deeply in debt to European creditors and increasingly subject to outside influence. Its decline created a power vacuum in southeastern Europe, fueling tensions between Austria, Russia, and emerging nationalist states. Those tensions would explode in the early 20th century and play a key role in the road to World War I.
That's where we'll leave things for today. In our next episode, we'll explore the idea of the responsive nation-state and the limits of exclusionary nationalism, looking at movements like the Dreyfus Affair, the Irish struggle, anti-Semitism, and women's suffrage. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget you can follow us on Instagram at Hammer History Productions for updates about our music and podcast projects.